Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats.
Do we turn the mic on when we want to?
I think we might have to use the gavel. See what happens if I do this. See if it works. Call it Molnir. Hammer of power. It's there.
Cracks walnuts with it.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being timely. I apologize that we're starting late. We were just making sure that we got everybody who wanted to be here in. And good morning to anyone watching on the live stream. Thank you very much for being with us. So I'm very excited to be back with you here at the UN after our very successful discussions yesterday. Today, what we're turning our minds to, really, is the question of how do we harness all of the opportunities? How do we exploit and make the most of all of the opportunities that we discussed yesterday? I was really blown away by the discussions yesterday, by the diversity and richness of the opportunities, by what's already going on in this area, and by the immense enthusiasm and momentum we see for further work in this area. So today is about being clear-eyed and a little bit steely-minded, if I can put it that way, being realistic about what we need to do to really exploit those opportunities. And as a result, you'll have seen the title for the whole day is Challenges. This is not to be pessimistic, this is to be realistic and pragmatic. So what we're going to start this morning with is a series of reports from the rapporteurs from yesterday's hothouse sessions to highlight for us the key themes that they heard, the opportunities they heard, but also to think about what we would need to do as a community or set of interacting communities to realize those opportunities. And I'd like all of you who are listening, watching, here in the audience at the United Nations or indeed online, to bear that in mind as you're listening to these reports. What does this mean about how we make choices in order to exploit these opportunities? And I say make choices because realistically, with limited resources, one can't do everything. What we're hoping to get out of this discussion today is a sense of where does this group think are the best tennis shots to play? Where are the highest probability winners? What themes, what projects, what areas of collaboration, and what are the challenges that stand in the way of realizing those possibilities? So, without further ado, I'm going to turn us over to Professor Todd Landman from the Rights Lab and the University of Nottingham to talk to us about the hothouse session A yesterday, vulnerability mapping and modeling. Over to you, Todd.
Thank you, James, and good morning, everyone. The session on vulnerability mapping revealed a number of things across the session and the folks who presented, but I also noted a set of enduring themes in what everyone was saying, and certainly the questions that came from the floor highlighted these enduring themes, which I saw across many of the other hothouse sessions as well yesterday. And I'd like to reference something I wrote for Delta 8.7 not long ago. It's in the forum section of the website about measuring human rights. The human rights community has been measuring all different dimensions and categories and aspects of human rights for over 30 years now. And I would turn your attention to that piece because I think a lot of the challenges we face in this particular area of work on modern slavery is very, very similar to what the human rights community has been doing for quite some time. And in that piece, I reference a kind of four-step way of thinking about the measurement challenge that we all face. And the first step is really about the background concept itself. There was a lot of discussion yesterday about what we mean by modern slavery, and we know this is a contested terrain. But I also heard people say there's no legal definition, and I would argue with that. There's a lot of law there already. The 1926 Slavery Convention, the Palermo Protocol, the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines on the legal parameters of slavery, etc., actually delineate the concept rather effectively. And that takes you really from the background concept to what one might call a systematized version of that concept. And once those two steps have been taken from a background concept to a systematized concept, then the discussion turns to indicators. And I heard a lot of discussion in our session and across the sessions about what are the indicators of modern slavery. And in my view, it seems that they go really on a continuum from what we might call direct indicators of modern slavery to indirect indicators of modern slavery. And I think the direct indicators are things like actual acts that people do to one another, the dyadic relationship between perpetrators and victims and or survivors, certainly violations of human rights in terms of people being trafficked and coerced into an exploitative situation, whether that's sexual exploitation, child labor, or any of the other issues that we discussed yesterday. And it's important for us not only to think about victims and survivors, but also perpetrators. So we learned a lot about perpetrators yesterday as well, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, because part of the drivers of modern slavery certainly is around the incentive structures for why people get involved in organized crime and organized criminal activity around this topic. And from the indirect side, a lot of what we discussed yesterday was not actually measuring slavery per se, but markers and indicators that might suggest there is a problem of slavery that needs to be examined in further detail. So we heard about perceptions, we heard about feelings, we heard about individual decisions that a young girl might make going on Instagram, and how then those set of decisions works its way through to an exploitative situation. We also heard about objects. The work on brick kilns is fascinating, because what you're doing is using the best data science possible to find objects. And we had a long discussion in one of the sessions yesterday about the relationship between objects and people and behaviors. And if people know they're being watched, do their behaviors change? And equally, how fixed are the objects related to modern slavery? And the brick kiln is a great example. But there are other examples. There are behaviors. There's micro-level things that we can look at, as well as macro-level things, and structural structures within economy, socioeconomic structures. So from the direct to the indirect, there are a panoply of indicators for us to work with. And finally, the fourth step in this framework for measurement talks about scores on units. And so, what's the quantitative score on what unit that you're looking at? And I heard this a lot in our session yesterday. Is it those individual decisions that young people take that Dominique said in the opening session? Is it people's answers to survey questions, for example? Or is it something else? And so these scores on units are, is it an individual person, a country, a sub-region, a city, etc.? And what does the score mean? And again, you have everything from events coding, acts, counting acts, the numbers of things that have happened, the case management files of the IOM, for example, 91,000 cases. So the case is the unit of analysis. Or you move one step out and you engage in what's called standards-based coding. So you read a country report and then you have a post-hoc coding of that country report. The Chinganelli and Richards data set on human rights does this for worker rights protection, for example. The survey data that we solved for Maria Salvo on child labor, this is a survey approach. So this is asking random sample household survey questions to groups of people to determine perceptions and experiences of child labor, for example. Socioeconomic and administrative statistics is also something that could be looked at. And finally, what I thought this conference was about big data. So all of the other sources of data, from bank records to suspicious activity reports, to all sorts of things, from private sector around electric meters in houses to the number of occupants in a house, those sorts of things that allow us to triangulate our data in ways that are those indirect measures of modern slavery. And I think the contribution from James Goulding and the work that he's been doing in Tanzania, for example, contributes to that. So taken together, it sounds like my alarm is up there. Taken together then, if we think about all of that, it's about data capture, data collection, data synthesis, data analysis, and finally inferences. And the inferences are only going to be as strong as the samples you take, the biases you seek to eliminate in the analysis you do, and ultimately the sorts of theories and concepts that sit behind the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Todd. And thank you in particular for sticking to time. That was very rich. A number of key ideas, I think, in there to do with systemization, frameworks, the need for rooting that in theory, but also having operational indicators, units of analysis. I suspect we're going to hear those coming back throughout the day. Thanks for kicking us off to such a great start. Turning to my right now, I'm going to gavel her in because Zoe's been asking to be gavelled. There you go. Zoe Trodd.
Very official.
I was actually asking for the chance to gavel. So maybe later.
If you stay within time.
Great. So I'm reporting back on the ICT session, which I thought was really brilliant. We heard from colleagues at GFEMS, at IST, at UNU. We covered a range of really interesting methods. We talked about network scale-up, longitudinal migration tracking. We talked about predictive modeling, dark web analysis, apps. And these were things that were focused on advances in faster prevalence estimation, protecting migrants. These are techniques focused on slavery in apparel supply chains, on disrupting trafficking networks, on enhancing the agency of survivors. And I think across the discussion, we came up with about 3 big challenges that also had opportunities. The first was how tech can actually keep up with perpetrators, so echoing what Todd just flagged as a key theme. We talked about perpetrators who tend to adapt their approaches in response to some of the advances we make. There were some interesting suggestions about how we might respond to that, and they included providing data to end users, for example, law enforcement, who then can help update that data, help nuance it with additional detail so it becomes a really useful feedback loop. Connected to that, staying ahead of patterns that are constantly changing, so designing tools from the start where we can regularly add or remove questions or languages, for example. And committing to a really constant maintenance of these AI tools, where we're always watching for underlying data patterns changing, trying to understand how to predict tools that traffickers might pick up in the future, trying to stay ahead of them. So that was one big challenge and opportunity. A second was using tech in a way that does reach everyone, or at least more communities and populations than the usual sort of social media reach, for example. We observed that more and more people have mobile phones, but that this still is a very fragmented global digital community, so not everyone is part of the same set of networks. We face challenges as an anti-slavery community of accessing really diverse populations. We might be making presumptions based on that limited reach, which may even do damage. All of which means we need to access people in ways that work for them, that reflect their networks and their realities. So that's an opportunity to, I think, work harder to understand, for example, the motivations of frontline responders and other communities for being in this space in the first place, trying to understand the possibilities, the limitations of their approaches to technology. And then a third big challenge we talked about, the unknown unknowns. And we acknowledged these were really scaring us because we also have a huge number of known unknowns. We know we often have trouble reaching women or linguistic minorities in operational data. And so because we have so many known unknowns, we probably have a really scary number of unknown unknowns. And I think there, in terms of a solution, we move towards a focus on, for example, collecting and indexing open data as a way to piece together intelligence. So we talked about how to approach large collections of public data where you otherwise would not see patterns and structure unless you were really committed to indexing all those indicators. And we wondered if here might be where we start to see unknown unknowns. So those were the 3 big themes, I think, that came out of that session.
Well, Zoe, you still have 2 minutes left, so I think you get to gavel yourself out. Well done. Big themes there, in particular around the way that our design choices are going to constrain the data we collect and therefore the patterns we see, and the need for both reflection and I think probably reflexivity in the way we build those systems that Todd was talking about. Fantastic. Moving right along, we come to Zoe's right, to Davina, and I guess we'll offer the same thing. Anyone who wants to use the gavel, if you stay within time, go for it. You start now, Davina.
Thank you, James. So I'm reporting on yesterday's session on mining government data. So my session included speakers such as Luis Fabiano de Assis. He's with Smart Lab Brazil, and he was talking about some of the vulnerability modeling that they've been doing to try to predict ripe areas for intervention, specifically at the municipality level, so a very local level. I also had Claire Gallup of the UK National Policing Initiative, and she was her presentation focused on their work establishing multi-level analytical teams that could then coordinate the data from over several law enforcement units to then the state and national resources, and then Julia Kosis of the Lehigh County Regional Intelligence Center, and they were also talking about some of the work they've done on gang data and specifically mining law enforcement information. So this panel really came up with 4 major discussion points that I'll share with you all, and then I think there were probably 8 takeaways that I think I'd like to highlight. So the first is that the quality of data is a big question. There's structured data that we can use. We're all pretty familiar with that, more like law enforcement case information. But there's also unstructured data that Julia pointed out is an untapped resource where the free-form narrative information and a lot of police reporting can really add some important context to some of this modeling and some of this information, but that it's very resource and time intensive to mine and very difficult to train algorithms to identify with that human or expert intuition. We also had questions about temporal and spatial data. So not just administrative data lags and vulnerability data, for example, in the Brazil case, but then also geographic and other boundaries that would matter. We also touched on the fact that many of our panelists use network analysis and graph theory in their work. And this was a pretty big point of conversation with our audience as well. And I'll touch on some of the takeaways there. Another thing we focused on was the importance of communicating those complex findings to policymakers without losing accuracy or nuance. And that was something I think we kept circling back to in our discussions as well. Finally, the coordination of this type of multi-tiered analysis was a really critical part of this discussion. In terms of the 8 takeaways, what I would say they are is 1, collect data for purpose. Claire shared a really important example where not all information that was already being collected by law enforcement units would necessarily be able to easily be used for any type of new analysis. So her unit is actually finding the information that they want and collecting specifically that information. She's found that that's been more useful when sharing information across units, and it's actually addressing the questions that they're hoping to address. In terms of network analysis, it seems to be really appealing to look at all of this unstructured free-form data, and actually as you look into a lot of the cases, Julia Kosis and others have found that when they're looking at law enforcement cases, they can find multiple points of connection as you go further and further into a case. So setting boundaries along what you think is important in terms of these analyses is important, otherwise you could just kind of spiral into a rabbit hole and find connections. Claire also emphasized the importance of answering a few questions well. So she discussed the challenge many of us face with being in a position of trying to kind of respond to operational directional changes, to demands for information kind of immediately, but rather focusing on having a disciplined approach to answering very few questions that you think you can achieve and answering them well. In Brazil, what we noticed was that a lot of the information, a lot of the policy interventions and resource allocations were based on rhetoric or anecdotal evidence or even personal political affiliation. So even though the models were socioeconomic and very broad, focused on broad vulnerability factors at this level, it was still much better than nothing. And so having these initial first step models was at least some way of tailoring recommendations. Something that came up from the audience that was really very useful was the concept of feedback loops. So in the early stages and iterations of all these models, to make sure that as you're testing them out, as you're looking at interventions, to try to get some mechanism of reporting back how effective that's been. Something else that was noted by Claire was that there's a coalition of the willing. So that sometimes the people that come to join the stakeholder groups you're working with are the ones that are interested and want to be a part of that effort, but they may not actually be the ones you need. So focus on those who are willing to work with you, but then also make sure that you recruit the ones that may be more resistant, but you actually do require. The 7th of the 8 takeaway points I wanted to emphasize is that we should be aware, of course, of implicit bias in building these AI models. So even if we're trying to build a machine learning algorithm and we're picking the cases that we're training that model on, we're already building in some bias about how these patterns are occurring. So to be very wary of that. And then the last and very important point is that the survivor perspective is critical in contextualizing a lot of the law enforcement cases from a perspective that lots of law enforcement agencies couldn't employ. Thank you. I didn't make it, though. I was a word off. Thank you, James.
Well done. Thank you so much, Davina. Really, a model of concision and efficiency. 12 points in 5 minutes. I hope there were lots of UN delegates watching and learning. We were all closely taking notes. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come straight on to the next speaker, which is Hannah Darnton from Tech Against Trafficking, who is going to report on the Slavery from Space mini-hothouse.
Great. Thank you so much, James. And welcome, everyone, this morning. Thanks again for being here. I'm reporting out on our Slavery from Space panel that we heard yesterday with speakers such as Austin Choi Fitzpatrick from Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies, Doreen Boyd from the Rights Lab, and Andrew Zoli from Planet Labs. And what I'd really like to do is focus on three kind of primary themes that we saw emerge throughout the panel yesterday. The first was talking about actually democratizing surveillance. We talked a lot about drones and the use of satellite imagery and satellites themselves over the course of the panel. And we noticed that as tech becomes more cheaper and more accessible for the wider population, whether it's drones or satellites created by rogue NASA engineers, it's changing who can use it and how it can be applied to new social issues by potentially marginalized populations. And this in turn has a wider effect on the social and political environment that we live in today. There's an inherent tension between tech and politics, and this is something that Austin really focused in on yesterday. Tech changes the politics and the political environment that we live in by providing new perspectives and insights to the world around us. And it necessitates new policies and actions that have to be taken into place. I think it was Austin that actually used the example of embassies. We've built up so much security at a ground level, but when you think of satellites and drones, we haven't created those protections over the actual embassies themselves. So not in terms of just physical infrastructure, but the way that we're considering these new technologies also necessitates a change in the way we think of everything else, our security, our privacy, et cetera. And in turn, that has an effect on the politics that we need to pursue and encourage. And tech is only as good as our ethics. It's not a patch for political will. We need to make sure that as we consider these new protection mechanisms and these new uses of technology to further our own missions, that we're also considering the ethical ramifications around those issues. The next is that, and this is something that Doreen and Andrew really called upon yesterday, is that tech can't solve all of our problems. We still have a human component that is extremely necessary as we continue to pursue and advance these new technologies. And an on-the-ground understanding is really needed to accompany those. For example, we came up with the human centaur that we talked quite a lot about yesterday. So looking at the use of technology in combination with human efforts. If we're looking at deforestation in the Peruvian Amazon, we need to be able to see what are the preceding effects of deforestation. What are those notable indicators that we need to keep our eyes on in order to know what to look for next? How do we know where to point the lens of technology to actually identify where slavery is occurring? Technology can't be used in isolation. In fact, has to be used with partners on the ground who know these issues, particularly in human trafficking, better than anyone else. So in that vein, we still have to be cautious of whose hands we're putting this technology into. Is it being used in the right way? And how can we assure that moving forward? How can we conduct the proper due diligence to see that this is utilized in the best possible way? So following on from that, it's data. Data is the easy part to gain, but it's that human translation. It's the application of that data and that new technology that we really need to continue paying attention to. This needs to be selectively applied, and the power and the politics behind these matter. And the thing that I'd like to leave you with today as a consideration is that these new insights, and this is something that Andrew brought up towards the end of the panel, was that these new insights, whether from satellites or drones or other forms of new technology, may not support what we currently believe, and that we're currently working in the human trafficking field and the human rights field writ large on an information deficit. And many times, we're working on hunches. So these tools can increase evidence, but they're both confirming what we believe and disconfirming what we believe. And we need to make sure that we're paying attention to both sides. So today we'd like to continue addressing a lot of these core topics and considering these and the challenges that we face. And if you're interested in digging in even more, we did find that their Science magazine put out a piece actually last night on the panel itself called Researchers Spy Signs of Slavery from Space. So feel free to take a look at that article as well.
Fantastic. Well done. Well within time. Would you like to gavel yourself out?
Of course.
Great job. A number of key themes there, I think, Hannah, that will really animate the next discussion that amazingly you're going to moderate on pipelines. So thinking about how we govern the data that we're developing and the tech that it fuels, and indeed how that then comes to govern us in a sense. So a lot for us to dig into there. We're going to come now to the other side of the panel, to Kilian Moote. Excuse me, Kilian. Who is going to report to us on the hothouse on fintech. Over to you, Kilian.
There we go. Great. Thank you so much, Shane. So yeah, our discussion was really about how financial tools, when we talk about fintech, financial tools, how might they be used or how are they currently being used to really engage and disrupt the business of trafficking, the business of human trafficking. We had three really interesting panelists, one coming from the Southwest Border Tracker, another from Stop the Traffic, and then a third from Arabesque, an asset management firm that's specifically using data to help improve investment decision making. So there was really kind of two different vantage points that our speakers were coming from and how they were touching the financial sector and seeing ways that you could use technology to address this issue through financial means. The first was the Southwest Border Tracker and the Stop the Traffic efforts were both kind of looking at anti-money laundering issues. The ability to take first structured data, so taking in financial transaction data, to try and identify potential risks or situations in which forced labor or trafficking is actually happening through actually looking at the financial transactions. The second area was actually what Arabesque was doing, which was trying to take unstructured data and different data signals into an investment strategy process where they might say a business that you as an investor are holding or is actually benefiting or participating in trafficking. So these were two very different but interconnected ways in which our panelists were looking at financial system and how technology can be used to address trafficking more specifically. Kind of a few different areas that we thought were emerging or interesting. Obviously when it comes to the anti-money laundering work, that really starts from a basis of structured data, so taking in the financial transactions. Our colleague from Stop the Traffic then talked about adding in unstructured data to add additional context, and they're specifically working with an alliance of different NGOs on the front lines to help contextualize that data. So take in individual reports or information that they have that wouldn't necessarily be about financial transactions, but be about actually instances of trafficking rates to help kind of provide a little bit more context to that data itself. So it's kind of layering on the data infrastructure as well to help you get a more precise look at what those typologies of trafficking might look like. And then the last kind of data input that we were talking about was really social sentiment data or sentiment data more generally. And this is what Arabesque really talked about doing, layering on top of the research that they've done, kind of alternative signals. So maybe that's news stories or sources where an individual company or an individual actor has been identified as being connected to a situation of forced labor or slavery. And then the other being kind of social network analysis. So looking at social media data, analyzing that and trying to identify, are there other signals that we're not picking up on that we could identify that would give us a better sense of where trafficking and slavery is occurring. So a few challenges that we kind of saw or emerged from the discussion. One is that while the structured data coming from financial institutions is great, it's really helpful. It's been particularly helpful as it relates to sex trafficking or the specific movement of people and paying for individuals through a trafficking situation. It doesn't get at all forms of trafficking, right? Not all forms of trafficking touch the financial system. So particularly we're talking about issues of forced labor, debt bondage, wage theft, or just simply individual institutions where not all money transactions are occurring and showing up in the system. So how might we tackle that challenge? The other thing that we talked about is this unstructured data, so taking in this data from NGOs. Really, how idiosyncratic is that information? How scalable is that data architecture to help us get a better picture and understand what are the likelihood of trafficking and what is this information telling us? And then the third that we talked about, that social analysis data, really how kind of biased is it? As we talked about news or other ways of analyzing news, does news media favor big brands over those that are actually connected to forced labor or connected to the other forms of trafficking? And then how much is social network or social media data really accessible and mineable to a degree to which it can actually inform us? So a few observations from taking away as we look at this is that clearly the structured data when it comes to financial transactions has been really helpful for the financial system to help identify and improve ways to identify potential trafficking situations. But really where we need to begin to explore is how do we look at these other forms of trafficking that are not necessarily touching the financial system where we don't have structured data. How might we use the collective mind share in this room to help us understand how we get at that underlying information where it's not publicly accessible. There's inherent limitations there that we're probably not talking about right now, big data problems or big data analysis that can be done, but that doesn't mean we can't use systems to better collect and analyze that data from the first place so that we can be informed in the future. And then the final thing that I'll just point out as a final piece that we talked on very briefly that what didn't come up in the conversation was this concept of gates. So pre-competitive conversations, whether that's insurance underwriting or others, other ways that the financial system itself, the providers of capital themselves, can be utilized and leveraged to help address this underlying issue. And then the other was financial inclusion, specifically financial inclusion of survivors of trafficking themselves. How might the financial system and fintech help address some of those underlying issues? They did not come up in discussion. I think those two areas that we could really dive into and explore more fully.
Thanks so much, Kilian. That was a really rich conversation yesterday that you boiled down to almost 5 minutes. I'm afraid no gavel for you, but nice try. Finally, we're going to come to Paul Jones on Kilian's left, who's going to report on the very interesting, as I hear, session about orphanage trafficking. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, James. So I'm going to talk about a session we held on a relatively newly recognised form of trafficking that's occurring via orphanages. So we started with an excellent background presentation from our colleagues at the Lumos Foundation, and I'll recap some of the main points that they made. So firstly, they consider all institutions to be harmful to children, just to varying kind of degrees. And this has been known for quite a long time, like for over 100 years since the first kind of articles were written on this. There is a lack of reliable data at the moment, but a recent Unicef report estimated 2.7 million children are in institutions currently, but it's suspected that the real number is somewhere between 8 and 16 million. So we identified 4 different connections between trafficking and orphanages. So firstly, children are trafficked into orphanages, out of them, and they're also placed into these institutions. But they also become more vulnerable to trafficking, to subsequent trafficking, after they leave. So we focus particularly on trafficking into institutions, and for the purposes of profiteering. So the idea is that these organisations are trying to make money from the children. And a recent study in Haiti indicated that 80% of children in institutions are not actually orphans. So a large driver for this is what is so-called voluntourism, where tourists are encouraged to donate to orphanages. So we split into 2 separate smaller workshops for a kind of interactive brainstorming session. The first one looked at defining, operationalizing and measuring orphan trafficking. And the second looked at technical solutions for finding hotspots, financial flows and data sources. We came up with a lot of different ideas. I'll just give you a flavour of some of the key themes. So on technical solutions, we agreed that there's a need for new data collection opportunities to fill the large kind of data gap that currently exists. At the moment, there's small-scale interviews and surveys are commonplace, but there's also a need for kind of to enable much wider scale, ideally kind of self-reporting via kind of apps or websites. And we also had an idea to focus on the data trail from voluntourists. So things like social media comments, reviews, ratings, perhaps even a sort of customs declaration that they fill in while entering and leaving the country. And also from volunteerism agencies and tour guides, so things like adverts saying where they're sending people and so on. So we agreed that we need to define a set of indicators and features that are indicative of trafficking, and then manually validate them with known institutions before we can start constructing any kind of data science model. In terms of other strategies to bring about change in this space, we need to start with non-technical approaches, so particularly awareness campaigns for potential voluntourists. Things like at schools and universities, and changing cultural perceptions in certain countries that children may be better off in institutions. Secondly, potentially government or NGO-based standard setting for institutions would be a helpful step, maybe perhaps backed by a certification scheme. But longer term, we don't actually want to identify good versus bad orphanages. Instead, we really want to work towards the larger goal of rehoming all institutionalized children, ideally in families, because sudden closures can be even more harmful to the kids. So even though this is becoming a big problem, there are reasons to be optimistic, because as soon as people become aware of the issue, we're a big step towards solving it. since this form of trafficking is unique compared to others in that it's backed by well-intentioned funding. And indeed, the money is not actually the problem. If all of the $100 million that's donated per year to orphanages in Haiti was reallocated to reunifying or rehoming the children, that would easily be enough to solve the problem in Haiti if used properly. So even though it's a big problem, there are reasons to be optimistic, and there are definite steps that can be taken towards solving it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you also get the opportunity to gavel yourself out, having stayed nicely within time. Thank you to you all. You've all made up considerable time there without, I think, sacrificing the richness of the discussion. So thanks for a terrific job. We have about 10 or 15 minutes left before we move straight into the next session. What I'd like to do with that is really elicit from all of you your brief comments and interventions that go to the three things that in the blurb on the agenda we said we'd try to do with this session. And those were, just to remind you, to identify what are the opportunities we got out of yesterday for joint problem solving, what are the challenges that emerge from these discussions, and the third that I think has come through less so far is what are the applied and theoretical research agendas here. So just before we do that, and as you're thinking about that, could we just do a quick show of hands? Some of the workshops did this yesterday. I think it was quite useful. Could you put up your hand if you think that you come primarily from, and I'll give you the options before you put them up, primarily from the anti-trafficking, anti-slavery practitioner or research community, or more from the AI, machine learning, computational and data science research or practitioner community. So those are we just want to get a sense of the balance of people in the room. Also, because I'd be particularly keen to elicit interventions from the AI, machine learning, data science side of the room about where you see the applied and theoretical research agendas that came out of the discussions yesterday. So are you more from the modern slavery type side of the house? Great. And are you more from the computational science side of the house? Great. Okay, pretty even. Fantastic. So the floor is open. If you want my attention, please press the button on the microphone in front of you, the one on the left with the picture of the diamond and some strange waves coming out of a mouth. And then your microphone will get in the queue and I will see the light and come to you. If you don't have a microphone, just gesticulate or stand up or throw something at me. Any reactions to the discussions yesterday? In particular on these questions of what were the key things that stuck out at you as key areas for joint problem solving or theoretical or research agendas that we as a group may need to give some priority to if this effort to bring these tools into this area is to proceed effectively. Yes, please.
Sure. My name's Emily Wyatt. I'm representing Uncharted Software. We make a platform called Telfinder. So I've talked to several colleagues. Part of what our platform does is that it gives law enforcement access to online data from the commercial sex industry. So ads and review boards and forums and things like that. We hold a massive amount of data because of our platform and what we provide to law enforcement. A great opportunity that I've found here is the ability to reach out to potential research partners, because much of what we have are, so I am a human trafficking subject matter expert, but most of my colleagues are software developers and engineers. What we don't have in-house is social scientists or research professionals. So it's been a great opportunity here to make connections with people who would be able to dive more deeply into our data, for which we don't have funding currently, and understand from 300 million ads over the last 7 years, what are we seeing in terms of recruiting patterns or types of services offered in different locations. There's just a massive amount of learning that we could do about the online industry, and so that's been a great opportunity for us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emily. Other thoughts, comments, suggestions, reactions? Too early in the morning. Yes, please. Thanks.
Hi. Is it on now? Okay. My name is Kelly Dorr, and I'm with the National Human Trafficking Survivor Coalition. I'm also a former legislator and a child survivor. One of the things I am curious about is how many groups in here actually use survivor input, and how much of that is applicable to the policy. Because one of the things that I recognized as a former legislator is we were making laws for people, by people, but we didn't always include them. And so sometimes when we create policy, while it looks really good on paper, it's not always applicable to the survivor or the survivor community. So I'm just very curious to know how many groups in here are actually using survivor input and are actually taking that into the processes that we are using to put forward to help our communities.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. That was certainly a theme that came up several times during the day. I'm not going to do a show of hands. I think that's a little confronting at this time of morning, but it's certainly a theme I think everybody's taking very seriously, and I think we will all be trying to bear in mind going forward, and having that experience in the room, for example, yourself, is absolutely crucial to making sure we stay mindful of that, and it's not just a discussion on the morning of the first day and then we all forget about it. So thanks for bringing it up again on the second day. Do I see you gesturing, Min? Or anyone else? No? Yes, please.
I'm Chandra. I see so many research here happening. Many organizations do your own research. Why don't Delta 8.7 compile all those organizations that do the same thing, the same element, different method to be in the in internal data, like example, organization X doing child labor, research on tobacco field or on the tea plantation or on, on the cotton industry. So all those people will see the data from each organization who do the same thing, and you compile the data, how you make the data more accessible for all organizations that can see the data, because otherwise so many different data that make people confused which one that we want to use. I think use this platform. I encourage use this platform to be able to compile your data. Thank you.
Thanks, Chandra. That's very helpful. I see three more interventions. I'm going to come to you, 4 more at least. Many of them are from probably people that put their hands up for the anti-slavery camp. Can I please strongly encourage the AI, machine learning, computational scientists? We want to hear you as well, your views on research agendas that emerged potentially from yesterday. Okay, lots of people, so you're all going to have to keep it brief. I'm just going to start on the left and work my way around. So we'll start here. Thank you.
Thanks. So actually building on what Chandra just said, I think that there's not only an opportunity to combine data sets, but for example, yesterday I heard of 2 new case management infrastructures that were in some phase of development, which builds on a third that I was aware of before. It seems that if we have multiple people spending large amounts of money to develop the same kind of technology, that's a waste of the second and third funding. So I would encourage not only to combine data sets, but to build a consciousness of which software tools are actually in development and try to combine efforts to build those.
Thank you, Jessica. That's Jessica from Annie Cannons, for those who weren't with us yesterday. Yes, please.
Okay, my name is Dominique Rosepowitz from Arizona State University, and I was really impressed yesterday that we talked so much about labor trafficking. We've been stuck in the sex trafficking space here in the U.S. for a long time, and I really think that movement is great. I feel a tiny bit left behind in our sex trafficking space, simply because we haven't really found the solutions yet. We're really struggling with some really basic things, and as I talked to Nadia Bliss about some of the challenges we face in our field, working with law enforcement and working with victims, is we still don't have some of the really basic tools that we need to combat this. So as you go into big data, as you go into bigger forms, I want to caution you that we still haven't built the framework and the and the laddering of what we need to actually solve some of the crimes on the ground. So, for example, we don't have a national sex trafficker database that we can share among law enforcement. So I work with 2 different police departments, the Phoenix Police Department and Las Vegas Police Department, and sometimes I'm the conduit of a trafficker case, and that should never be, right? That makes absolutely no sense. So I'll tell them a story about a trafficker that I read about, and they said, "Oh my God, that trafficker's here, and he was shot recently. We should have known that he was working in another community." So I want to encourage you to work on some of the laddering as well. Don't get so stuck in the big AI. Really try to figure out how we can build some of those pieces so we can get better knowledge from the top of that artificial intelligence and machine learning work.
Thanks, Dominique. I think, again, bringing us back to the importance of coordination and the organizational aspects that we're going to hear a lot about today, I think. Sir, I think you had well, there's 2 of you. I'll come to the one closest to me first.
Okay, good morning. Felipe Arosvera with Ohio University. One of the things, I participated in the session of orphanages. It was really... I was an ignorant in the topic, and it was an eye-opening session for me. One of the things that I believe we kind of agreed was this problem of having a moving target, right? It's something that evolves. It's something that it's a multifaceted. There's a lot of interactions, and the naive approach of thinking that if we do something, the counterpart will do nothing and just remain, it might not work simply. So as a part of the kind of the research, I come from the network optimization side of it. How can we find these venues to understand not only the network structure and patterns, but also the behavioral components of both parts, and how we can kind of use all these data methodologies to understand it and to tackle the problem in a more comprehensive, like holistic approach?
Thank you very much. I think that element of dynamism and the fact that we're dealing with people who are going to be strategic and react to our interventions is absolutely crucial, and that's come up in several of the interventions this morning. I'm a strategic theorist myself. My favorite quote in strategic theory is from that well-known strategist Mike Tyson, and his quote about strategy is, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." I think that's one thing we all need to bear in mind in planning our interventions here. Behind you, there was a gentleman. Yes, that's you. Far away.
Thank you. My name is Keith Marzullo. I'm with the CCC. I'm also at the University of Maryland in the iSchool. I'm actually building on that last comment. Dynamism is important, but another community that would be worth pulling into this is the cybersecurity group. There's been a lot of work that has been done in cybersecurity of understanding who is waging the attacks, and it's commonly called whack-a-mole in that group, that you come up with a new intervention and the group will come up with a new way to get around that. And a lot of success has happened by looking less at the arms race part of this and more at the organizational part of this. I'm thinking of some of the work of Stefan Savage, who was able to do some incredible work in looking at the business model that was being used in waging cyber attacks. So in terms of a research agenda, I'm all for bringing in AI and machine learning, but I'm suggesting that we look at some other people who've looked at the dynamic aspects in the context of cybersecurity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keith, and we look forward to your further interventions later in the day. The woman here, yes, please.
I'm Christy Weigel with United Against Slavery, and I first just wanted to mention just the importance of the collaboration even from this conference, because after Maria spoke yesterday with the ILO, I was able to introduce her to Kelly Dorr, who you just heard from. She also serves as our legislative liaison, and the importance of just integrating that policy development within the data that we're doing, because it's so important. But one thing I did want to just touch on, as you're mentioning upcoming research that's going on, I briefly mentioned it yesterday, as we're talking about the challenges that we're all facing, that is specifically the area of focus that United Against Slavery is focused on, is unresolved challenges facing right now 29 frontline stakeholders. And so as we continue preparation for the National Outreach Survey, it is vital that as we look at components to end slavery, to make it harder for slavery, that we're connecting with the human element of those that are serving on the front lines. And again, within our approach, we're specifically having custom survey questions for 29 different stakeholders across the globe. So it's a collaborative effort of everyone coming together to document what is and isn't working, where there are gaps in research. You know, in the financial sector, session yesterday, we talked a lot about the financial component of preventative measures, of the money that's spent that encourages trafficking from traffickers. What we did not talk about is the business of anti-trafficking and the billions of dollars that are spent to combat human trafficking when sex and labor trafficking survivors still struggle to have their daily resources met. And so I can tell you, within hundreds of data points that we're going to be collecting within the National Outreach Survey, we do have a financial component that we will be collecting data on what are the true costs to combat human trafficking, not just from one stakeholder group, but from 29 different stakeholder groups. And I don't know, for anyone that's interested in what we're doing, we did bring some of our info booklets. Kelly, if you'll raise your hand again, we can provide those as well, just for the importance of being able to identify those challenges on a much broader scale so that we can come together to collaboratively problem solve those together.
Great, thank you. There were a couple more hands. We're now cutting into the next panel's time. Could you just put up your hand if you previously put up your hand and said you wanted to intervene, just so I know? There's one. Anyone else? No, okay. I think it's just you, Chloe. Can you come to a microphone so the people on the internet can hear you?
That's okay. I should have got here a bit earlier. Yeah, thanks, yeah. Hi, Chloe Seta from Lumos Foundation. I just wanted to say we were very grateful for the contributions yesterday to the hothouse on orphanage trafficking. And I think for many people in the room reflected that this was the first time that they'd touched upon this issue or this form of exploitation. And it really felt like the beginning of a conversation, a very exploratory one. We made sure we were clear on that as well, that we don't have those answers. But one thing that we wanted to stress is that we really feel this is a preventable issue and a solvable issue. And many people think of it as a little bit niche, but actually I think all forms of trafficking start off being considered as a little bit niche until you start actually getting better data and realizing how pervasive and widespread it is. But the data sets on this particular issue should be, in theory, more accessible because we're not trying to access the networks of criminals or organized crime groups. What we're trying to access is fairly simple information like how many people volunteer in orphanages, how much money goes into orphanages overseas, what is the role of faith-based groups in funding orphanages, and things like that. So we were very heartened to hear some positive ideas about how we can access that data, because it should be, in theory, more easy to access that, because those are the drivers, and we need to look at the drivers in order to tackle this issue. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, there's a wealth of rich ideas there. I think what we would encourage you all to do is to think carefully through the course of the day about how this can all get operationalized. We will have a session at the end of the day where we talk quite specifically about how do we take this kind of discussion forward. I think there's already a sense emerging from conversations that people wish to see some version of these discussions continued. What we need to hear from you in that final session is how. What should we be focusing on? What specific concrete collaborations are you looking for? So a number of you were suggesting things there during the course of those interventions. Please keep articulating those in your mind. Keep talking to other people, maybe during the lunch break, and be ready to bring those as concrete suggestions for how we can prioritize in that final session. Finally, before I turn over to Hannah to help us move in that direction, we spend a lot of time at the UN talking about engaging the youth, and I always think that there must be a single youth who gets a lot of engagement, and I just want to welcome him. And thank you very much, young man. It's the smartly dressed young man in the corner. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope it's not too boring. We welcome your feedback as well. You probably know more about the coding aspect than most of us in the room, so feel free to pipe up at any point. Thanks a lot for being here. I'm going to turn over now to Hannah Darnton for the next session.
Great. Thanks so much, James. And thanks to everyone for your contribution.